Good morning. I'd like to call the meeting of the Joint Committee on Senate Finance and Assembly Ways and Means to order, please. Committee Secretary, please call the roll.
Assemblywoman Benitez Thompson. Assemblyman Frierson.
Here.
Assemblywoman Gorlow.
Here.
Assemblyman Hafen.
Here.
Assemblywoman Howdegee.
Here.
Assemblyman Levitt.
Here.
Assemblywoman Miller.
Here.
Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
Here.
Assemblywoman Peters.
Here.
Assemblyman Roberts.
Here.
Assemblywoman Titus. Assemblywoman Tolles.
Here.
Assemblyman Watts.
Here.
Senator Cannizzaro. Senator Dennis.
Here.
Senator Dondero Loop.
Here.
Senator Goycochea.
Here.
Senator Hammond.
I'm here.
Senator Kekeffer.
Here.
Senator Ratty.
Here.
Senator Severs-Gansert.
Here.
Assemblywoman Carlton.
Here.
Chair Brooks.
Here. Thank you. Please add members as present as they join. And I would like to also remind all the committee members to mute your microphones when you're not talking. And if you have a question, you could put try to notify me in the Zoom chat for this committee meeting, and I'll recognize you and we can get the question answered. I also like to remind the public that's watching that you have many ways to participate, and the information for contacting this committee on the agenda for today, as well as if you go to the Nevada Legislature's website, to the Nellis portion of that website, there's a banner at the top of that on every page that gives you all the different ways that you can join this meeting and participate. And it will have a public comment at the end of the agenda. And if you want to make public comment, if you get on that and sign in, and we'll call you based on the last 3 digits of your phone number when the time is appropriate. We have a pretty dense agenda this morning. We have the Judicial Branch budget presentation, and we have the Commission on Judicial Discipline budget presentation. First up is the Nevada Supreme Court and the budgets for the Judicial Branch. The Judicial Branch is exempt from the State Budget Act. The budgets presented this morning represent the request of the Judicial Branch, not the governor's request. I'd like to invite Chief Justice Hardesty to begin the presentation when he is ready.
Morning, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Carlton. I appreciate the opportunity to be able to present the budget to the Joint Committee. I want to begin by pointing out that, as you'll recall, I provided an overview of our budget to the same committee, Joint Committee, on January 20th. And so I don't want to belabor some of the points that were covered at that time, but I will go over the various points and specific issues that we identified during that presentation. As you can see from our first slide, which that up. Yeah, let's go on to the next page. Rick, thank you.
Come on.
The Judicial Branch budget is a total of $140,197,576. 66% of that funding is from the general fund, and 34% comes from administrative assessments, reserves, and other both federal and fees. Of the general fund request, 55% of our budget, 50 million plus, is judicial elected officials' salaries. 16% is the Supreme Court budget. 10% is for specialty courts. 7% is for the Court of Appeals. 4% is for the law library. 3% is for judicial programs and services. 3% is for judicial retirement system, and 2% is for the senior judge program. On the next page, we have made a request for general fund increase of a total of $4,387,939. That figure will have a few slight changes in it as we go through the presentation, downward adjustments. Most of that salary increase is the result of funding the salaries for the additional judges that were approved in the prior legislative session and have now been elected and are now serving office. There is an unfunded base salary of $375,000, IT infrastructure of $772,000, which we'll go through in detail in this presentation, and some other adjustments and enhancements of about $141,000. On the administrative assessment side, I don't want to repeat the information in this slide. I believe the committee is very familiar with the comments I made on January 20th and the issue surrounding administrative assessments. I would just note that since this funding source began in 1983, it's been altered 8 of 13 sessions. As I have noted on January 20th and in previous presentations to other legislatures, this is a unstable and not a very reliable source of funding. During the pandemic, that issue really surfaced in a dramatic way, which I'll touch on in a moment. I also want to reiterate concerns that the court has expressed about this funding source because it impacts what we actually receive from it. As you can see on the PowerPoint slide, the order of collection impacts what is ultimately received by the court. So it is a misnomer to suggest that we would get, as we see from the breakdown, 62% currently of administrative assessments. That's of the amount that's actually collected after all of these other fees come off the top. So in 2010, the legislature began to take $5 per administrative assessment straight to the general fund off the top. And then there's $2 to the county treasurer for juvenile court, $7 for municipal judicial justice court funding. And then we divide the remaining amount between the executive branch and the judicial branch based on changes that have been made over the course of the last 3 sessions. We are now to a point where the judicial branch receives 60% of the administrative assessments ultimately collected, and the balance goes to the executive branch. As I mentioned in January, and I think I may have mentioned it in 2019, with the adoption of Marcy's law, there's a requirement also, that constitutional requirement, that restitution be collected on many of these charges first. And so when someone who is faced with having to pay some of these fees also has a duty to pay restitution, those get collected ahead of administrative assessments. In the pandemic, as we explained during the special session, the impact to this 34% funding source for the judicial branch was severe. While we were meeting the governor's requests for 12% and 15% budget cuts to the general fund, we were also sustaining a 33% reduction in the amount of administrative assessments being received to that 34% segment of our budget. I want to again express my sincere appreciation to the legislature for their action taken in the special session, where they adjusted the Authorization and Appropriation Act provisions, allowing us to carry forward some of our reserves to help, as a defensive measure, mitigate against the consequences of this reduction in revenue source. This next slide shows you a bar graph. We presented this on January 20th that shows the decline down to 2021 projected. We have projected AAs for 22 and 23, but as you can see, it won't be until way deep into the 2023 fiscal year before we where we were at the beginning of the pandemic on March 17th. That even at that point, though, we would be roughly 2 to 3% below what was being received at that point. This next slide shows who else receives administrative assessment revenue. That, of course, would be important to your joint committees as you think about those budgets. The AG Council for Prosecuting Attorneys receives 2%. AG Victims of Domestic Violence, 1%. Post-training, 28%. Criminal History Repository, 56%. And Victims of Crime Fund, 13%. If we could go on then to the next slide, which just begins to talk about enhancements affecting multiple budget accounts. As you'll see through most of this presentation, the vast majority of the enhancements that we are requesting have to do with IT necessities, placements of various items. I have asked Rick Stephanie, who is the IT manager of the court, to participate and join me in this presentation, along with Todd Myler, of course, the court's budget manager. You may recall that I announced January 20th that Robin Sweet had resigned as the director of the state administrator of the courts, and her successor, Catherine Stocks, has joined us here in the AOC conference room and is attending and participating in this presentation. Mr. McCormick and some other staff members are in a different conference room for social distancing. So let's begin with some of the items that are identified here. Mr. Stephanie, if you would, please, let's talk about the remote desktop server and this issue. If I could introduce this, though, I do want to mention that during the pandemic, the court has substantially gone to a remote work environment. It has been extremely successful, and we've also been able to maintain our progress on all of our cases by utilizing the servers in order to be able to accomplish oral arguments, as well as our contacts with our staff. I'm very proud of the way the court has progressed through this pandemic. We continue scheduled oral arguments. This was started up again in June after the initial break in the pandemic, and it's continued right up to this coming Monday or next Monday and Tuesday, where we'll have oral arguments then. Essential, though, to the court's transition to remote access or remote business is remote access to the court's network. So, Rick, maybe to this particular item first.
Okay. Good morning, Rick Stephanie for the Supreme Court. E365, the remote desktop server setup, is to create a virtual desktop environment for all of our remote employees to work securely. Currently, we have many employees using VPNs to get into our network, but those documents and information are going across the wire and it's being stored on those local PCs, which is not the most secure fashion to keep some of our data. This solution will allow us to keep all of that data, documents, everything in-house. So nothing is stored on somebody's personal computer or a laptop that could go missing, whatever. So that's what this enhancement is about. E240 Adobe Lifecycle Replacement is just an upgrade to the whole desktop publishing suite. We use Judicial Ed uses that, AOC uses that, and the Supreme Court used that to do opinions and orders and everything else. E715, the Windows Server software upgrade, is to upgrade some of our older servers to the latest Windows Server software. Microsoft regularly unsupports, should I say, older versions of the software, and you must upgrade or else risk major security holes. And so E245 rebalancing AA revenue.
So as to that particular item, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the court staff has been working with LCV fiscal staff to determine an adjustment of the AA distribution percentages as outlined in E245 across budgets that may not be needed at this time. What is necessary is the court is again trying to build a defensive posture against these declining AAs. And while we normally have a 90-day operating reserve, we want to increase that to a 120-day operating reserve just to protect us for having adequate funds available to be able to meet the obligations contained within these budget accounts. At this time, the changes to the splits in NRS 176.059 do not appear to be necessary. So the current split of 62% to the judicial branch and 38% to the executive branch would remain the same. However, we do need to either through expiration of the June 30th, 21st date for those splits, we need to adjust that or move it on a permanent basis. A budget BDR appears to be necessary, and we've communicated with the General Finance Office as well as fiscal about that BDR to adjust that date. The Supreme Court budget, we'll get into some of the specific budgets, is...
Justice Hardesty, if we could maybe pause right there between these budgets, and I know we have some questions on the budget that you presented already. Sure. I believe my first question comes from Assemblywoman Hudigi.
Thank you, Chair. And I have a couple of questions, if that's okay.
Please go ahead.
Okay. I just had a quick question regarding, first, before I get into my other questions regarding the balance forward. So I noticed when you started, you started the presentation, you mentioned that you were requesting an increase in about $4.3 million from the general fund, but you have a balance forward that's gone up from $9.4 million in the 2019 to 2021 biennium to $11.5 million in the 21-23 biennium. Can you just kind of walk me through why the balance forward's gone up and why you're requesting more general fund dollars if you have more that you're moving forward?
I'm going to ask Mr. Myler to respond to that calculation.
Yes, Todd Myler for the record, manager of budgets for the Supreme Court. Thank you for the question, Chair, through you to the Assemblywoman. What you're seeing there is, yes, we do have accounts that have reserves that are adjusted by, that are funded by the administrative assessments. We also have other accounts that are do not generally have reserves, such as the Supreme Court's budget accounts, the law library, the senior judge program, et cetera. Those that are funded with general fund as well do not have a reserve. The reserves are really only in the AOC controlled budget accounts, 1483, Administrative Office of the Courts, 1486, USJR, 1487, Judicial Education. Those are the accounts that really have those reserves that we're talking about that are need to be straightened out.
Okay.
Did that answer your question?
Yeah, and yes, and that actually leads me into my next question regarding the reserves. I noticed in your slide there was an asterisk next to budget E245 saying it may no longer be needed. Can you walk me through that? Because I know that had been an initial request to kind of shift administrative assessments between budgets, but then it was my understanding that it was actually going to be eliminated, that decision unit. So can you confirm whether that request is going to be eliminated?
Yes.
Yes, once again, Todd Myler for the record. We have worked with staff, and since this budget was built in September, that decision unit at the time, as everything was constructed, it did appear necessary. At this particular point in time, we worked with staff to look deeper into things after more adjustments have been made during the budget process. And it appears at this time that that decision unit may not be needed. And so it is possible it could be eliminated, yes.
And one follow-up, Chair?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. And then regarding, speaking about reserves, I know the recommended reserves is 90 days, but there's been a special request to increase that to 120 days. And even with the elimination of E245, I think most of the budgets will have in excess of 120 days reserves. Can you walk me through why that's necessary or why the request for the exception on reserve levels?
Sure, I'll ask Mr. Myler to comment specifically, but again, I want to mention that this is a defensive measure against the unstable nature of the administrative assessments. We had hoped through October that we might see some rebound in those receipts. November and December was disappointing. And the trend line is not very exciting for the remainder of this fiscal year. And it also calls into question projections for the upcoming biennium as well. So these additional periods of time on the reserve, we think, are going to be necessary to protect our budget accounts that are funded through AAs. Mr. Myler, if you want to, your fiscal staff, by the way, and Mr. Myler have gone through extensive calculations over these reserves, and we can go into some of the specifics of these charts if you don't have them available, but essentially these calculations would show that in some accounts we may be over by 120 days, but in other accounts we still haven't reached the 120-day period. So once again, having the ability to adjust the dollars between these accounts that was afforded during the special session allows us to smooth this out. But a lot depends on how it's allocated and what the expenditures are. And so in order to maintain a stable operating set of reserves, we need to be able to adjust those funds between those accounts. And what we received from the calculations that were done by fiscal staff and what Mr. Myler worked with them on showed that in some accounts we were in a little bit over 120 days, and in other accounts we were below 120 days.
And so you expect maybe in the next biennium to go back down to the 90-day reserve limits. This is just to kind of address the unpredictability of pandemic.
Yeah, yes, ma'am. Yes, Assemblywoman, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Next up, I have Assemblywoman Tolles.
Thank you, Chair. Actually, my questions were just answered.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Well, Senator Dennis.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to ask first, because you just covered this on E365 on the remote desktop server, just so that I understand, you're basically going to have a client on there, like if they're calling in from home or a PC or a laptop from home, and they're going to connect to that virtual connection in the office. So they're actually doing everything in-house. They're just using the computer as a way to connect to the system. Is that correct?
That is correct.
All right. And previously, they would actually use their computer at home, and actually all the computing was going on the home computer, and they were just connecting to pull down stuff from the server. Is that right?
Yeah, Rick Stephanie for the court. Yes, that is correct.
So the question I have then, what's the time frame for implementing that remote desktop?
Rick Stephanie for the court. Before the COVID shutdown hit, we had actually instituted a pilot program to start this. We started about 3 or 4 weeks before the shutdown. So this funding to do this, we would move rather quickly. We really feel that this is very necessary to keep control and the security of that information and those documents in-house instead of sending it across the wire to somebody's home computer someplace.
Okay, so you're thinking how long?
How long? If the project is approved, we would start right away in July and hopefully have it up and operational within 3 to 4 months.
Great. Thank you. And then the other question I had, I don't know that you've covered this yet, but it's in my notes as I went through this, has to do with the, I think you guys call it MCGIS system. I had a question about how many agencies use that system currently.
Rick Stephanie for the court. McGuigis, are you talking about?
Yes, yes.
McGuigis, okay. McGuigis, for everybody who doesn't know, is called the Multi-County Interjurisdiction Information System. It is a straight system that exchanges data between many different justice partners, e-citations, DMV, DPS, law enforcement. We are moving, I don't have that data right in front of me, but we have 35 courts using it. We have Clark County, their CC-IGIS system, moving warrants over to DPS and the repository. Most of our courts that are on our state-sponsored case management system are moving e-citations from Highway Patrol and law enforcement agencies from them directly into their case management systems. And when those tickets or citations are adjudicated, those results are automatically sent to Department of Motor Vehicles. I know we have well over 50 or 60 partners using the system today, and we expect that to greatly increase in the future.
So do you distinguish between folks that need to access the system versus those that you're actually exchanging data with?
Rick Stephanie, I'm not sure what you mean, Senator Dennis. All of the people who use the system are direct justice partners. It's all kind of done in the background. So
I guess I'm trying to distinguish between, sometimes people just have to get information, but then you also have folks that have to actually input information that gets put into your system. Is there a distinction between that? I mean, do some people just have access to pull up information? They need to look up something versus some people that might need to actually upload information to the system or download, I guess, too. But
Rick Stephanie for the court. This is a straight exchange system. This is not a store system. So nobody has the ability to look at the system. The system does not store that information. It moves the data using XML from one system to the next. That's it.
Okay. So it's just changing back and forth. Okay. So, yeah, so if you could just share with our staff, you said probably over 50. If you could share how many the exact number is of the folks that connect with the system.
Okay, you bet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And just a reminder, please identify yourself when you're talking. So if you're presenting, so for our staff, so we can get our notes correctly. And I think next up, I think we have Assemblyman Roberts.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And a lot of my questions were answered previously about court assessments and the carryovers, but I had one more follow-up on that. And I know the projections, were down, and trying to forecast that's probably pretty difficult. And just curious as to why are the court assessments down? I mean, obviously, COVID has impacted the court system's ability to hold court, and are you monitoring those numbers, and and is there things that we can do to improve that? I'm just curious of how you forecasted that, and where do you think the bottleneck is?
Thank you for the question, Assemblyman Roberts. This is Justice Hardesty. I have been working on the court's budget since I joined the court in 2005. And I think that administrative assessments are one of the most difficult things to project that I've ever seen. I was an accountant years and years ago, and I just find it very challenging to predict what can come in. So much of it depends on the number of tickets written. We monitor those. We receive regular reports from local agencies, law enforcement agencies, about the status of that, Highway Patrol as well. We also, of course, monitor the cases in the justice courts and municipal courts that receive administrative assessments and these charges and adjudicate them, and so we monitor those. One of the things that is a challenge during a pandemic, when there's no traffic, there's no tickets, although we saw a few folks driving about 140 miles an hour. They got pulled over, but vast majority of tickets were not being written because the traffic count was down, significantly down. And then the other problem that the pandemic has produced is collections. A number of people have requested relief under statutes that exist that allow for the providing of community service rather than the payment of administrative assessment revenue. And many persons subject to those fines and fees have requested that relief. And I think that's a really good example of financial challenges that come with unemployment and many of the other circumstances that our economy is suffering under. As I mentioned as well, when people are paying their administrative assessments and fines, there's an order of collection structure. And as the schedules demonstrate, we in the executive branch who share in these fund sources are at the end of that collection line. So a person may pay against their administrative fee period, then not have the resources to be able to pay rent or to pay utilities. And so they seek relief for community service, or they just don't pay them at all, and then they go to bench warrants. And so that's not a healthy situation either. Either way, though, we don't get a collection on what's written. So the writing of tickets is not a direct correlation to the collection of the funds. And as I mentioned earlier, and this is, I'm not trying to say this to be offensive. I'm hoping it doesn't come across that way. When the legislature in 2010 was faced with the economic recovery problem, they took $5 off the top to go to the general fund. So that was another collection that impeded the amount of money that eventually gets to the Supreme Court. I don't know that there's anything really that the legislature could do about this funding source. In terms of the Supreme Court budget, I have commented before that it would make sense that we are not using this funding source to fund the Supreme Court. There is absolutely no correlation whatsoever from this funding source and the functions of the Supreme Court. We do not become involved in traffic tickets or traffic citations. It's not even within our purview unless we end up with a case that gets presented to the Supreme Court on a writ. All of those matters are heard jurisdictionally by the justices of the peace municipal courts around the state. But it is a funding source that has occupied the court's budget between 34 and 38, 39% since I've been on the court. I wish the legislature would simply put us in the general fund and call it a day and accept the risks and the challenges that come with administrative assessments, and then your staff can make those projections rather than our staff, to be quite honest. But we're dealing with this particular circumstance, and we're doing the best we can to provide these projections, and it is a very difficult thing to do.
Well, thank you, Justice, for the answer, and I appreciate that this is you can't count on this. I used to get calls from the city of Las Vegas when I was chief of patrol that we weren't writing enough tickets when we were reducing our workforce, and so I understand where you're coming from, and I think it's perfectly reasonable to allow you to hold larger reserves to carry over when you have this unpredictable cash flow. So thank you for the answer, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Assemblyman. Senator Dennis, I think, has a follow-up question.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just as a follow-up, as I looked at my notes, I realized I didn't ask the question that I needed to for Mr. Stephanie. When we were talking about the McIGES system, do you exchange information with agencies outside of that system, or is all your communication through that system?
Yeah, Rick Stephanie for the courts. Yes, we do. Like I said, DPS is one of our major partners. DMV is one of our major partners. All of the courts, obviously. This system is set up so once a document like an e-citation specification is written, any person or any court entity that needs to use that system can do so. As long as they write their interface into that system correctly, it moves data perfectly well.
But you still have other agencies, though, that aren't in that system that you're exchanging information or data with? Is that correct?
Rick Stephanie for the court. Are you talking about electronic data that we're exchanging with not through McIGES?
Yes. Well, yes.
Rick Stephanie for the court. We, as far as I know, we don't exchange any other data not through that system.
Okay.
We've kind of set that as the standard. We've told the courts and the other partners if they want to move data electronically that system is the one to use. We don't force people. I mean, courts, we cannot do that. But I will tell you there are courts that are sending data directly to, say, DMV directly, not through McIGES. I think Las Vegas Justice Court is one. No, Las Vegas Municipal Court is one. I'm sorry. They write their own interface. A number of years back, DPS had said, if you want to exchange data with us, McIGES is the way to do it. It's a one-stop shop it's a gateway that they don't have to support multiple different interfaces. All they have to do is support one interface. So I might add that system, the McIGES system, was developed in-house We support it 100%. We don't charge user fees. We don't charge transaction fees, nothing. So that cost is all borne out of one of our budgets, out of our 1486 budget.
Okay, so if they're doing electronic, they would do it through that system. If they don't want to do electronic, they would just do some kind of manual submittal.
Correct.
Right. Okay. Great. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ms. Stephanie, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So with that, I think we're ready to move on to the next budget, 1494, the Supreme Court budget.
So let's turn to slide. I do want to touch on slide 10 briefly. I have previously outlined the duties of the Supreme Court. I don't think I need to repeat those unless there are members of the Joint Committee that have questions about the constitutional functions of the court. What I did want to touch on briefly, though, is slide 10. As you may recall from my presentation on January the 20th, there has been a significant impact on all of the courts caused by the pandemic. In the case of the Supreme Court, we have adjusted our projections for fiscal year 21 based on two things. The number of filings has declined, as you can see, by about 706 cases per year for this upcoming fiscal year. The number of cases being transferred to the Court of Appeals has gone down as a consequence. The number of cases we are resolving is still relatively close to what we've been resolving before. But what has changed, of course, is the number of cases pending. As I explained on January the 20th, this does not mean that all of these cases are ready to be adjudicated. Indeed, the number of cases pending is a combination of cases that are still in briefing, so the court can't even get to them yet, or are in the civil settlement program, so we're not ready to decide those yet, or are fully briefed and are ready for argument and decision. This is the lowest, though, pending cases I've seen since I've been on the court. It goes back decades. And what this reflects is the impact of the pandemic on the district courts, which is our source of work primarily. The district courts around the state have not been able to conduct trials in many instances, and certainly not jury trials. And I am working now with the chief judges of both the 8th Judicial District and the 2nd Judicial District and a number of rural judges to develop a plan where we can eventually reopen these courts to get these cases moving. But this is a serious justice problem. The number of untried criminal cases around the state is substantial, and the number of untried and unresolved civil cases is even worse. And so working through that backlog will be a serious problem. As it impacts the Supreme Court in the next fiscal year for 2022 and 2023, we've gone back to increasing our projections because essentially once we begin to clear out the backlog of cases that exist within the district courts, we're going to see a significant wave of appeals and writ proceedings that'll be coming to the Supreme Court in the upcoming years. Budget account 1494 that supports the Supreme Court. This gets back to a couple of the things that Senator Dennis was talking about. I'll ask Mr. Stephanie to talk about the upgrades in this account. As you can see, almost all of the enhancements in this account relate specifically to IT work.
Rick Stephanie for the court. Starting with E351, the DPS interface upgrade. As many of you probably know, DPS has been in the middle of upgrading their whole back-end system, their J-Link system. So as soon as they are completed with that, we need to upgrade our interface to go into their new system. That's what that enhancement is all about. We did have this enhancement on last biennium's budget, but DPS did not progress far enough on their upgrade to for us to use this enhancement. So we needed to put this back in. E352, we want to add a new document type to the MAGIDAS so it can transfer temporary protective orders directly out of the court's case management systems instead of the courts having to use two different systems to enter TPOs. The document management, E225, E248, E226, and E350 we'll be talking about in another slide in just a few minutes. The Ectron replacement, which is E228, our websites are hosted off of the state's EATS infrastructure, and they are in the middle or planning on upgrading their whole back-end system. And so when they upgrade their stuff, we have to upgrade all of our stuff to make it work. That is obviously an estimated cost. We don't know what that's going to be until they really get moving on theirs. E-filing system enhancements, E227, that is to enhance our internal e-filing system. If we need changes, if we need additional modifications, that's where we use those hours. Public scanning workstations, E229, these were to put in 2 workstations with scanners in our public areas so the public can come in and e-file directly to the court. The equipment replacement, E710, this is in every budget account. This is our typical computer replacement, printer replacement, batteries, anything like that, or normal wear and tear on systems. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, then we go to the next slide. This is a proposed modification to budget account 1494. And I'll ask Mr. Bell to go into that discussion. It begins with this very brief story. We're in the process of hiring a replacement for our current Chief Marshal, Darrell Keithley. He retired. And in that process, I discovered that instead of having 8 full-time marshal positions, we only had 7.5. And so I asked, working with Mr. Myler and he with your fiscal staff, we have formulated a plan to get us up to the full 8 marshal positions without creating a budget consequence in doing so. So, Mr. Myler, if you could briefly summarize this slide and what this relates to.
Yes, thank you, Chief Justice. Once again, Todd Myler, Manager of Budgets for the record. So this modification involves a 0.49 increase in FTE. We would go from 84.51 in this budget account to 85.0. That is so that we do have 8 full-time marshals rather than 7.51. We did find an imbalance between staff. There was also a security contract in place for temporary security personnel, which we had actually been utilizing as full-time personnel. So it was another equivalent of another full-time FTE down in Las Vegas. However, so this proposal reduces that security contract significantly by 2/3. And then there are also some decision units, as Mr. Stephanie mentioned, that are are either proposed for complete elimination or for modification. And you see the dollar amounts on those. So it is a net. This proposal that we have submitted to staff and staff has acknowledged does result in a net savings to the general fund of over $12,000 for the upcoming biennium.
Unless there are any questions there, Mr. Chairman, we'll move to the Court of Appeals.
We do have some questions. I think the first question I have is from Assemblywoman Monroe Moreno.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Always love it when we can save money, and definitely want to see full-time staff there that's our staff and not contracted staff. But could you just explain just a little bit more to us of how the recommended restructure of the Las Vegas Marshal's office will result in improved security protection with the reduction in the contract with the security company?
Sure, thank you. Currently, with the current staffing and with Mr. Keithley, well, first of all, let me back up. Our chief marshal serves both as a chief marshal and as an operating, functioning marshal who has duties and responsibilities. The chief marshal was located in Las Vegas. Mr. Keithley was hired there and was performing a full-time marshal function as well as chief. When he retired, the question then became, where would we hire the next chief and where would they be located? We wanted to get the best candidate. That's what we're in the process of doing. But in that process, I discovered that we were essentially working with 2.5 people and this outside contract. And what troubled me was the fact that that outside contract was utilizing 2,096 hours for the year, which was way more than a full-time position. And what I wanted was post-certified police officers providing the security for both buildings. And we would deploy 4 marshals in Carson City and 4 marshals full-time in Las Vegas who are post-certified officers. We believe that improves security. We believe that this proposal does both. It saves money and it improves security by having the qualified people who should be in that building and patrolling that building. And as you may know, the Supreme Court building in Las Vegas is a beautiful building. We get a lot of visitors there who come by who think it's more of a historic art piece. But the fact of the matter is it's located in an area that has some challenges from a policing standpoint. And so the security demands are even a little bit higher there than they are in Carson City. And so we think we need full-time police officers there to marshal that building and provide for the safety and security of the roughly 60 plus people that work in that building now, and the hundreds of people who were coming into the building and we hope will be returning soon when we get past the pandemic. I hope that explains the reason for this decision.
No, that truly does explain. And thank you for that explanation. I did not realize that the chief also did the duties that a line officer, a daily line officer would do. He's kind of holding two hats. So I truly appreciate that explanation. And as you look for that full-time position, will you be looking to promote within and the new person take the new position? So as you look for that new post-certified officer, and will you be promoting that chief's position from the officers that are currently there? And then my last question is, as you made the decision to not move forward with the computers, the other recommendations that you're not going to go through with, how are those revisions and eliminations for your IT decision unit, how's that going to impact the courts?
So this is Justice Hardesty. Thank you for the question, Assemblywoman. First of all, we started the search process. It was an open search. We did receive both applicants from within the system and from outside the system. We haven't completed the decision yet, but we had 4 finalists, and we went through and interviewed those folks, and they're all very capable people. The decision I'm hoping will be made later this week as to who the chief marshal will be, and the deployment of personnel will be based in part on where that chief marshal is located. And as I mentioned earlier, the chief marshal has assigned line duties as well as running the department. I mean, I don't want to disparage the importance and the responsibilities of being able to keep track of everybody. We do have a lieutenant who assists the chief marshal, but scheduling training and scheduling the officers and the like is just part of the job. And when you've got an 8-person force located at 2 ends of the state, there are some administrative responsibilities there. With respect to the decision units that we have identified here, we believe that we could purchase some of these items this fiscal year from funding that was available to us as a result of the decision that was made by the legislature in the special session, allowing us to carry forward some of the reserves that we had as a guard against the AA drops. And so some of these items we purchased in advance. Because we did that this fiscal year, we have savings in the upcoming fiscal year.
Perfect. Thank you for that. I appreciate it. Mr. Chair, that's all the questions I have.
Thank you, Assemblywoman, and thank you, Justice Hardesty. I think that is it for that budget. I think we're ready to move on to the next budget, 1489 Court of Appeals budget.
Once again, I want to just explain an operational change here that motivates this budget and the enhancement in this budget. When the Court of Appeals was created and staffed initially, we had planned and anticipated that it would have the judges, 3 judges, would have 2 law clerks and a judicial assistant, a judicial chambers assistant. Some might equate those duties to a secretary, but it's more like a paralegal. And we built that partially because that's the way the Supreme Court operates. But what we've learned in the ensuing 6 years, 5 years plus, is that there's a greater need for the chambers to have staff attorneys rather than what I'll call a secretary or a paralegal. And so we have...
Could I interrupt you really quick? We're meaning for us to be walking through this with you on the slide deck that you presented. We no longer see it. So if you could go to
sure.
Main function.
There should be a slide entitled Court of Appeals Budget Account 1489.
Perfect. We can see it again. Thank you so much.
Okay. So this enhancement relates to the reclassification of what was previously set up to be judicial chambers assistants to 3 staff attorneys, or I should say 2 law clerks and a staff attorney. Just to remind everyone that the primary purpose of the Court of Appeals is to engage in the resolution of error correction cases. It is a high volume court in that sense. And many of the cases present legal issues that are not going to produce precedent. And as a consequence, the need for, again, I'll characterize it as secretarial staff in the chambers is much, much different than it is for justices on the Supreme Court. And what we're trying to do is to add staff attorneys to help support those 3 judges in their resolution of cases. So we had identified an impact of about $32,741 in order to be able to accomplish that objective and increase the capability of chambers to be able to handle those cases and produce, frankly, greater output of error correction type cases. In the last few weeks, Mr. Myler has been working with your staff, noting that the staff attorney salaries in chambers are much lower than the staff attorneys that are on the Court of Appeals staff. We'd like to continue that dialogue with your staff to increase that slightly, but this was the proposal that the Court of Appeals made to the Supreme Court, and we agreed to endorse it. The other issue that is identified here is some replacement equipment that is essentially the replacement that Mr. Stephanie covered. So unless there are any questions there, Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the next slide.
Yeah, well, Justice, we do have a question on this budget account before we move. And I believe it's Assemblywoman Gorlow does.
Yes, thank you very much, Chair. I did have a quick question. Who is currently performing the legal work that the Judicial Chamber administrators are unable to complete?
Well, that's been part of the problem. We wouldn't permit them to work out of class. And so because of that, that work is being done by the law clerks and, more importantly, the staff attorneys who support the Court of Appeals. There are both criminal and civil staff attorneys that perform those functions. What we're trying to do, Assemblywoman, is increase the amount of output by having people who are lawyers performing these functions and are working within class. Having JCAs doing that work would be having them work out of class, and frankly, they aren't licensed attorneys either.
Okay, so the current incumbents wouldn't meet the staff attorney minimum qualifications then, is that correct?
I believe with the exception of one chambers who has an attorney who's working at a JCA salary, and we have been wanting to correct that situation because that person's out of class.
Okay, thank you. And a quick follow-up, Chair?
Please.
Okay. So then would there be a potential layoff that could result in the recommended reclassification?
Yes, ma'am, there would. I think, though, that one of the folks wants to go to law school anyway, and so actually there might be an opportunity provided as well.
Great. And then other processing legal documents and assisting with writing of legal briefs. What other benefits does the Court of Appeals anticipate by reclassifying the Chamber's position to the staff attorney?
I think you've identified the ones that we believe we would be able to achieve. And by the way, if I could just digress, Assemblywoman, this is Jim Hardesty for the record. I apologize. I should have said that. The Court of Appeals is producing and has been producing a little over 1,000 cases a year in its dispositions. If you look at the previous charts, you probably saw that it was about 1,100. I want to compare that with the Court of Appeals in Iowa and the Court of Appeals in Mississippi. Both of those Court of Appeals have approximately, and I'm just going to use approximate numbers, 15 judges. And they're resolving about 1,500 cases per year. I am so proud of what our Court of Appeals is doing. And this model that we adopted has been incredibly productive because of the use of our central staff lawyers to help support the judges in what their decision-making process is. So this proposal furthers the effort of increasing that production at the lowest possible cost and without piling on more judges.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Assemblywoman Gorlow. I believe we have another question on this budget from Senator Dondero Liu.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And thank you, Justice Hardesty, to you and your staff. I was just wondering, when you talked about the staff attorneys' advisory, supervisory duties, would those change with this recommendation, and what benefits would be gained from that additional level of supervision among the staff?
Well, you would have an attorney who is more experienced providing supervision with the other staff attorneys. Currently, we have staff attorneys who come in at a particular level, and this allows for better supervision of some of those staff attorneys.
Okay, thank you very much. It's just
I'm sorry, it's Jim Hardesty. It relates to the experience of the lawyer handling these cases. And many times, like many professions, lawyers need guidance. Younger lawyers need more guidance. And so that's what we're trying to accomplish.
thank you so much. I appreciate that explanation.
Thank you, Senator, and thank you, Justice Hardesty. I think we can move on to the next budget.
Okay, the next slide relates to judicial elected officials, and essentially that budget account is the salary costs for. Do we have the slide up, Mr.
Yeah, I think they have to cancel it.
I don't think the chair does anyway.
We do not have the slide anymore.
Okay. Be the next slide.
Yeah.
Now we see it. Thank you.
Okay. So as I mentioned earlier, the 55% of the general fund funding for the Nevada Supreme Court is are the salaries and of the 7 Supreme Court justices, 3 Court of Appeals judges, and the 90 district court judges. The budget reflects what that compensation is as authorized by the current statutory configuration for compensation to judges. This slide includes a reference to Senate Bill 3. I want to underscore, as I said in January, that the proposal that was presented, or at least offered to the legislature in the last session about a change in compensation for judges is not, I want to emphasize, is not part of our current budget request. This is a completely separate bill. It did not get a hearing in the last session. I don't know whether it'll get a hearing in this session, but it is not part of the budget requests that we've made in this budget. Unless there are any questions, Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the law library.
No questions. We'll save that for the committee meeting on that bill if and when.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chair. The law library is one of 4 public law libraries in the state. Mr. Sowers is the law librarian. He's an extraordinary librarian with a terrific staff. We are seeking to reclassify 2 of the librarian positions. These reclassifications will allow more of the collection of the library to go to digital research. As you know, there is of course, a trend in that direction, and would also facilitate more outreach that's being performed to educate potential library users on the library's offerings and services. And once again, those changes in services warrant, in our judgment, reclassification of those 2 librarian positions to accomplish those objectives. The replacement equipment is just the routine computer replacement that we use that is necessary for our computers to support that function. Unless there are any questions about that budget item, Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the Administrative Office of the Courts.
Please do. Thank you, sir.
That'd be budget account 1483. There are 32 FTEs in that budget account. As you can see from this list, most of the enhancements that are listed here are, except one, are IT related. So I'm going to ask Mr. Stephanie to comment on those, and then I'll circle back on E605.
Rick Stephanie for the court. So E710 is our typical equipment replacement, computers, printers. E225 in this budget account is to take our phone system from a hardware-based to a virtual-based system. We purchased this phone system a number of years ago, and the hardware is no longer supported, but we can move it into our virtual server environment. So that's what this cost is all about. The additional on-base licenses and Crystal Reports licenses, the court, the AOC, is taking much more advantage of our on-base document management system, and that these licenses and these report licenses are to support that effort. We're trying to move everything away from paper. Accounting has moved all of their stuff away from paper, which is great. And so HR is moving that way, and all of our other departments are moving that way as well. So IT training, the on-base conference, we have 2 developers on site that are certified in on-base to be able to program with their application interfaces. We have to maintain that certification, so they are required to attend a conference every 2 years. The Black Hat Security Conference obviously is to keep my staff up to date on security trends and training. The VMON conference, Veeam is a backup software that we use to keep control of all our backups and make sure we have consistent and stable data. And then the VMworld is VMware is what we use to manage all of our virtual servers.
And then this is Jim Hardesty for the record, Mr. Chair, regarding E605. This is an analyst position. It's being held vacant until January 23 in order to save administrative assessment costs or because of the reduction of administrative assessment revenue. This is a position that is important to the court to conduct data analysis and provide support for various committees and commissions that the court establishes to make improvements to the judicial system. As an example, the court just completed a 2-year analysis of the rules of criminal procedure and for the first time adopted a set of rules of criminal procedure that are applicable to every district court in the state. This uniform approach should provide improvements in the way lawyers practice in the criminal courts of our state. And important in that process is having staff support that can collect research, do minutes, schedule meetings, post transparent information and deliberations on the Supreme Court's website. We do not have the benefit of that position and won't have until January of 2023 because of this limitation. I cite this as another example of how the administrative assessment funding issues impair the core functions of the court as it seeks to improve the judicial system. Some of you might have noticed that there is a recent petition that has been filed with the Supreme Court and will be heard on March 3rd, in which the court will study the subject of the use of specialty courts in the area of water law. This is a huge step forward for our state as we consider how matters are handled in the district courts around the state that adjudicate state engineer decisions, water law and water rights. But because of the lack of staff support, I had requested, assuming that the commission is approved by the Supreme Court, that the state engineer's office help provide the staff support for that commission if it goes forward. We believe that this is a very important step for water law in our state, and frankly is supported by many stakeholders around the state. But this is an example of the importance of this kind of staff support for us to be able to perform these functions and conduct these studies. Unless there's anything further on this budget account, Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to the next slide, and that would be judicial programs and services.
Justice Hardesty, we do have a question on this budget account from Senator Ratty.
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. Good to see you. I'm just curious on if the assessments, if the economy turns around and we get back to normal and the assessments start to come in higher, would you fill that position earlier than December of 2022?
As speculative as the administrative assessments are, that decision would be speculative. I'd like to be able to do that, but the court has a number of priorities. This budget that we're presenting to you today does not reflect a bunch of cuts that we continued from the special session cuts that were made, that we did not restore. And if we had the funds, there would certainly be other priorities that we would like to be able to assess. Now, whether this particular position would be higher than some other priorities we'd like to restore, that is subject to the justice's discussions. But from my standpoint as Chief Justice, I would like to be able to restore a number of pretty severe cuts that we made and we have perpetuated, knowing the challenges that the legislature and the state is facing.
Thank you. That's super helpful understanding of your priorities.
Unless there's another question, Mr. Chairman, I'll move on to judicial programs and services.
Thank you. Please do.
This budget too has a reclassification of an individual from administrative assistant 2 to administrative assessment 3 and court research analyst 1 to court research analyst 2. These are not substantial dollar amounts, but they are certainly important to the people who are performing these functions and the kinds of tasks that they can undertake. The replacement equipment E710 is along the lines of what Mr. Stephanie has reported in previous conversations. These are routine computer or equipment replacement in this budget account for these staff. Unless there are questions about that budget account, I'll turn to the Uniform System of Judicial Records.
Please do.
This is Jim Hardesty for the record. Under this account, as you can see, almost all of the enhancements relate to IT work. This is another issue of an example of what Senator Dennis was asking questions about concerning McGuigas. I'll ask Mr. Stephanie to go through these 5 IT enhancements.
Rick Stephanie for the court. E225, the JWorks travel, is for our staff to travel to courts to bring up the newest version of the case management system. Our first court is scheduled to go live in May. And then over the next 3 to 4 years, we'll be moving all of our courts off of the old CMS court view system to the new JWorks system if everything goes as planned. eCourt data software, E227. This piece of software is to replace a service. We have a piece of software called Phone Tree that takes data out of the database for the trial courts and calls the defendants or the people who need to come before the court and to remind them of their appointments. This software is no longer supported. So the new software will not only, it could call, it could text, it could email. So that's a definite must. E227, the Crystal server licenses, is to increase the number of users that can be running reports at the same time. Currently, we have outside courts that if somebody's running a report, they need to wait until the next person needs to wait until somebody else gets off before they can run a report. McGuige's JWorks load balancer. We anticipate a large increase in the traffic through McGuige's, so we're going to need to put a load balancer in front with multiple application servers behind it to be able to handle that traffic. McGuige's warrants and warrant clears. Currently, the McGuige's system is set up to do warrants only with one partner. That partner is CCIGIS, which is Clark County. This enhancement is to modify the whole system to be able to work with all of the partners to move warrants through the system. Crystal Reports Upgrade is just to upgrade current existing software that will no longer be supported. And the replacement equipment is for typical computer replacement.
Mr. Chair, unless there are questions about that account, I'll move to Judicial Education Budget Account 1487.
I do not see any questions, so please do move to the next one.
The only enhancement in this particular budget account is for routine computer replacement. I just would identify this particular account is an area in which significant cuts were made in response to the pandemic and prior to the special session. And it has we have transitioned almost all, or not almost all, of the judicial education to virtual education. I think there have been benefits in that, and it has significantly lowered the costs. But I also think that there are areas where we need to restore ultimately at some point, probably not in the next fiscal year, on face-to-face education for our various judges around the state. We have not permitted out-of-state travel, and in-state travel has been very limited during the course of the pandemic, and will continue to be limited at least through the end of this fiscal year. So don't know if there's any questions about this budget account, but the enhancements are primarily computer replacement equipment. The next area is specialty courts, Mr. Chairman, unless there are questions about judicial education. Specialty courts, again, the court was finally able to obtain a statewide coordinator for all of the specialty courts. We're trying to improve significantly the administration and coordination of the multiple specialty courts that exist around the state and develop uniform approaches to a number of aspects of specialty court, including admittance requirements and the like that lead to substance abuse success. In this particular area, there is a need to have our statewide coordinator go to various specialty courts around the state in order to converse with the judges and staff who are operating 61 programs statewide. Then there's a small amount of replacement equipment for routine computer replacement identified in this budget. Unless there are any questions about that budget account, Mr. Chairman, I'll go forward to the other judicial branch budget accounts. Jim Hardesty for the record. These are accounts 1496, 1493, and 1491. They cover the Senior Justice and Senior Judge Program. These are funds that allow for judges to fill in when judges are sitting, elected district court judges are either vacant because of illness or an upcoming vacation. In our situation in Nevada, we have 26 plus new judges elected recently. All of them will need to go to mandatory training at the National Judicial College, and in many cases for the family judges to the National College of Juvenile and Family Court Judges. And they will be away from their duties for periods of time while they're fulfilling that mandatory education. And that will need to be, those functions will need to be provided by senior judges and justices. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, there has been an accumulating significant backlog in the district courts, and we hope to deploy some of the senior judges to help reduce those backlogs on an ongoing basis. Budget account 1493 is judicial support and governance. These are funded through preemptory challenge fees. These provide for district court judge travel in the rurals. We have a number of judges in the rural counties who travel great distances. I think a map I showed you on January 20th showing the size of District 11, the Judge Jim Shirley services. It runs all the way from Pershing County to Mineral County, and he's on the road probably as much as he is in court. We help fund his travel and others to be able to perform those functions in this budget account, as well as enter into contracts. We recently had a study that was conducted by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges that was funded out of this account. It studied the effectiveness and the compliance of family courts with the original statutory expectations for family courts. And that report is available on our website if anybody is interested in looking at it. And the last is judicial retirement. This is the system state share that is covering the district court judges in the state. If there are no questions on those budget accounts, Mr. Chair, I'll move to judicial branch one-shots. You may recall that in the January 20th presentation, I mentioned the suggestion by the General Finance Office and the Governor's Office that we move some items that had been in our budget to one-shots. And my understanding is that these items that the legislature might consider funding if there were funds to be able to do so. I want to go over these three. The first is E230. It's a statewide case management system. For those of you who have been in the legislature for a while, you've heard me talk about and the court talk about the JWorks system. This is a replacement case management system that we've been working on since about 2013. Dissatisfied with the vendor's progress, we undertook arbitration. We called a halt to it. In effect, we declared a breach and sued them. And as a result of that effort, we engaged in settlement negotiations that put the project back online. Those negotiations have continued, frankly, up until last week. I'm happy to report that we've made great progress in this regard. I think we're going to get some compensation returned to us as a result of those negotiations. We now have a new timeline for the fulfillment of their obligations, but we should know by May if this is working out as planned. And if it does, this E230 unit will not be needed on our one-shot list. Under E235, you may recall that the legislature approved funding for a feasibility study for statewide e-filing. This is a big deal. We've got a lot of districts in our state that do not have e-filing capabilities. And as a result of the study, we would like to begin, if possible, the implementation of an e-filing system throughout our state. This $1,336,800 starts that process of making e-filing available to all citizens of Nevada, regardless of where they live. And then lastly, E250 is a disaster recovery for our IT infrastructure. This is about $231,000, and it replaces aging IT infrastructure and keeps older equipment as a backup. We very much would like to consider that a priority if funds are available to be able to accomplish that objective when the legislature is considering the possibility of one-shot funding. Unless there are any questions about those items, Mr. Chairman, I think that concludes our presentation. Obviously, myself and the court staff are available to answer any additional questions that the committee may have of us today.
Thank you, Justice Hardesty. I do not see, actually I do. I have a question from Assemblywoman Tolles.
Yes, thank you so much, Chair, and thank you for all of that information. So many different accounts that we covered today. Appreciate it. So I just have two maybe overarching questions for future follow-up, and that would be, we talked a lot about some technological and system enhancements, and woven throughout this presentation was explanations about how they were necessary because we had to be able to coordinate with other enhancements, technological enhancements in other divisions, and they have to be able to communicate. But there was also some implied savings that are involved with those technological enhancements. And I just wondered if there's some way to quantify what we anticipate some of the savings are by, because we're investing in some enhancements, but there's also a reduction, it sounds like, in some man hours or being able to get through the backlog, being able to recoup some efficiencies. And so if there's just any way to quantify that, I just appreciate that information. And then the last thing is, I noticed that on the last page of the slides, and as well as at the very beginning of the presentation, that we're only looking at about $795,000 in federal funds that we're taking advantage of. And I do remember that we had some justice reinvestment funds, some other federal grant opportunities, and would just love to know a little bit more about what we're doing to chase more federal funds to help offset some of our backlog.
This is Jim Hardesty for the record. Thank you for the questions, Assemblywoman. We will see if we can address both and work with your staff with a response on both issues.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Assemblywoman Titus, do you have a question as well?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Justice, for your information and all that you're doing for the state. Just it's a quick question, really, along the same lines of Assemblywoman Tolles about the federal funds. Did our Justice Department get any federal funds from the CARES Act money or anything for this COVID pandemic?
This is Jim Hardesty. I think the answer, Assemblywoman, is yes and no. We are being reimbursed for some of our COVID-related administrative time. I think that Mr. Myler can speak to that directly. We haven't received any direct COVID funding to the court. The federal dollars that you see there is the court improvement project, which is funded for the purpose of helping promote the various children efforts that exist throughout the state and helps fund the coordinator for those activities. So that is not a COVID-related funding item.
So how much did you get then for COVID-related items?
Todd Myler, Manager of Budgets for the record. In fiscal year 20, we received across all of our budget accounts just over $300,000 for reimbursement for COVID administrative time, as well as purchases of PPE and such. This fiscal year, we have received reimbursement. I believe it was about $140,000 so far. We are still tracking all of our expenses and recouping those dollars. We just received payment last week on that from the governor's finance office. I would have to get an exact dollar amount to you.
Great. All right. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And thank you for the question, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. And with that, I don't see any further questions for the judicial branch and budgets. And I would like to thank Justice Hardesty and your entire staff for a very efficient yet thorough presentation of your budgets this morning, and as well as for all that you do for the state of Nevada and helping.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the opportunity to present.
Great. Next up, we have the Commission on Judicial Discipline. And Director Diley, if you are available to begin your presentation, I'd appreciate it.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, Chair Carlton, committee members. For the record, I am Paul Dyler. I'm the Executive Director and General Counsel of the Commission on Judicial Discipline. I am also the Executive Director of the Standing Committee on Judicial Ethics. Thank you and the committees for the opportunity to present the Commission's budget. I am accompanied by Valerie Carter, our management analyst. For the record, I have provided the committees with a copy of the Commission's outline of our budget presentation, as well as a justification memo dated August 17th, 2020, which goes into detail into the Commission's critical need of an additional attorney. As you know, the Commission is one of the smallest agencies in the state with limited resources and staff, and we are, as all other agencies in the state, facing many challenges. So I would like to say thank you to the legislature for its strong past support of the Commission's budgetary needs in assisting the Commission in carrying out its constitutional and statutory mandates in protecting the public by means of enforcing the Code of Judicial Conduct. I'll briefly discuss the challenges facing the Commission, and of course, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Clearly, we've seen a significant increase in the number of judicial complaints filed with the Commission. In fiscal year 2020, we received 215 complaints. We've also had 21 investigations, which clearly increases costs, staff time, and resources to process. There's also facing insufficient funding to continue investigations and prosecution of complaints. As you know, the Commission has been in a situation over the last 3 fiscal years where we've had to request contingency funds from the BOE and IFC, as well as supplemental appropriation requests. In fact, we may have to submit a supplemental appropriation request in this session. We're not sure yet, but due to the nature of our work. It is very unpredictable, so we may have to do that. And we do lack staff to address this increase in the complaints received by the commission, as well as to address and defend increases in legal disputes brought against the commission. So I will go into a little bit more detail on the commission's request for an additional attorney. Before I do so, I wasn't going to address our changes to the base budget, which are pretty minor, but I did want to point out for the record that with respect to Category 3, our travel account, due to the pandemic, the commission's hearings and meetings were canceled, and that amounted to $14,606. So this amount includes an inadvertent reduction of $8,946 in the final adjustment. So I just wanted to point that out for the record, and that we're asking that to be added back into the commission's base budget. Okay. As far as our enhancement requests, there are two. One of which is the most critical, and that is for an additional non-classified attorney, which will allow the commission to operate more efficiently and effectively, and at the end of the day, save money, taxpayer money, because as of right now, we have to, by law, contract with prosecuting attorneys. So when a complaint is filed with a formal charges are filed against a judicial officer, we contract with prosecuting officers, and we pay. They're independent of the commission. They're not employees, and we do pay per hour, which, as you know, can be very expensive. We also deal with independent or utilize independent investigators, and they too are not employees, and we have to pay them per hour. So having an additional attorney in the office is multifaceted in what we need, in that they can work with the investigators who are not experts in judicial discipline. They have their own business. They investigate not just for the Judicial Discipline Commission, but they have their own businesses and are independent contractors, as I noted. And so this attorney would work with these investigators and keep them on track, and also. Which is very important, because as a case goes forward in the judicial discipline process, once it gets to the point of a formal complaint and we have to hire a prosecuting officer, we're paying the prosecuting officers a lot more per hour than we are investigators. And since the investigators are not familiar, or they're not experts, I should say, in judicial discipline, it's very important for the prosecuting officers, since this is a unique area of the law, Judicial Discipline Commission work, that in the past we've had to reinvestigate witnesses, interview additional witnesses as the prosecuting officer is preparing for trial. And over the last several years, that has really added significantly to the costs of the commission, and the reasons behind the commission having to request contingency funds multiple times. So in addition to that, the additional attorney would work on the commission caseload, which, as you know, is increasing year by year, and also help defend against various writs, appeals, et cetera, that are filed with the Supreme Court. You know, we don't have any. It's very unpredictable for the commission to forecast how many writs are going to be filed against the commission. So as a law office, as a legal office, we have to, when that is done, we have to hire or engage the prosecuting officers, and it's a significant amount of work. So having that additional attorney would also help defend against those cases. And it's not just judicial discipline cases. As you know, any member of the public can file a writ against the commission, which would have to be defended. So it's just very, very difficult to predict and forecast what kind of expenses and resources we need in any given case. For example, we're not going to mention the case, but we are involved in one case that has exhausted close to 80% of our operating budget. And that is the reason, that's just one case. Add another case, 2, 3, 4 cases, and we'll be before the IFC every month. So very difficult, very challenging to predict those costs. So this investigative attorney is a critical need for the commission. The additional enhancement requests relate to 3 state-issued cell phones for employees. If you recall, last session, 2019, we were approved for 2 state-issued cell phones for the attorneys in the office. You had 2 attorneys in the office, and we're requesting 3 additional phones for staff for a number of reasons, one of which, as you know, many staff around the state are working from home, and it will allow them to communicate with judges that call the office, the press, as well as complainants and others in the public. And they would prefer not to use their cell phones in doing so. Some of the people that call the office are, I would say, aggressive and make threats against staff, et cetera. So I think you can imagine staff members are uncomfortable calling them back on cell phones. It also enables the commission to, if the virus continues or there's an additional virus in the future, that we're primed for being productive and from working from home, which we've been able to do, thankfully. It's a brief presentation. I have concluded my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
I appreciate it, Director Dyla. We do have a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions, but I also know that Chair Carlton has a question, and I think we kick off with her, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I apologize. I did not realize I had turned off my video earlier, so I have been here. So I guess I'd like to ask about the supplemental, of course. Do you have any idea when, and are there any thoughts about how much? Because we do need to get prepared for that.
Yes, Chair Carlson, thank you. Paul Dyla for the record. We don't have any particular, we don't know at this point. We're hoping we don't have to, and I know that doesn't provide a lot of comfort. But I believe, we have received IFC funds recently, and I think there's a work program that is on the next IFC agenda. So we're hoping that will take us to the end of the fiscal year. As I said, I'm hoping we don't have to do a supplemental appropriation. At this point, we won't have to. But if another writ is filed with the commission unexpectedly, then that would change the scenario. And as far as amounts, potential amounts, I would say anywhere between $40,000 to $50,000 potentially. It just depends upon what's filed with the commission.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you. That's not as many zeros as I was afraid of. So thank you very much. But do let us know so that we can plan. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Carlton. We do have a question from Assemblywoman Tolles as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for that presentation and the work you do, given the restrictions that you face and the challenges you face. You said that you have 215 complaints and 21 were investigated. Just wondering, how do you decide which ones to investigate? What's going to happen to the other 194? Is it a threshold and some of them just don't get investigated, or is that a backlog of 194 complaints that are still waiting to be addressed?
Thank you, Paul Dyla, for the record. Over 90% of the commission's complaints are dismissed on jurisdictional grounds, and that percentage is the same throughout the country with every judicial discipline commission. So the commission does not have, with the exception of certain enumerated exceptions, jurisdiction to move forward in the complaint process on decisional matters. So, if a judge makes a discretionary decision in the case, we don't have jurisdiction to go forward on it. So that is the overwhelming majority of complaints that are filed with the commission, and they are dismissed by law. There are a few exceptions to that, but by and large, that's the percentages. The investigations are that other 8 to 10% are investigated, and the determination of whether they're investigated depends upon if in the determination of the commission, if they believe that there's misconduct that warrants an investigation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Director Dyla. I have just a couple of questions regarding the new position that you're suggesting. And you've explained how it will protect the operation and make it more efficient and some of those efficiencies. Do you think it's going to actually lessen your dependence on contractors and investigators and special prosecutors, or just make them better? You think there'll be a reduction in your contracts is what I'm getting at.
Thank you. Paul Dyla for the record. I would say both. The work that the attorney would be doing would be pre-prosecuting officer. When we engage a prosecuting officer, it's typically prior to formal charges being filed. That is the beginning of the public process. Before formal charges are filed, that's the confidential phase. So typically prosecuting officers are not involved in the confidential phase unless a writ is filed with the Supreme Court or there is an interim suspension hearing. So the attorney working with an investigator, assisting the investigator, is critical. So when the case gets to the prosecuting officer, there's not additional work to be done. Witnesses to be interviewed or investigations to other things that have to be reinvestigated, et cetera. And I'm not saying that happens all the time, but it is difficult for an investigator who is not a lawyer and is not an expert in judicial discipline to identify various things during the investigation that may rise to the level of judicial misconduct where an attorney would. So that part of it will save a lot of money and time on the back end. As I said, the prosecuting officers get paid more per hour than the investigators. So having a prosecuting officer when he or she gets the case and having to go back and potentially have witnesses re-interviewed or other things going on, it costs a lot more money and, of course, a lot more time. As far as your question, whether it will lessen the dependence on prosecuting officers, it may and it may not. It just depends upon the number of cases that we're dealing with. Under law, when formal charges are filed, the prosecuting officer files those charges and prosecutes the case. So the time that the prosecuting officers are serving in that function would not be reduced in any case, but certainly the time they utilize and bill for to prepare for the case would be a lot less. Also, as I mentioned, writs that are filed with the Supreme Court and appeals sometimes, and we've faced this session or in the last year or so, that we're running out of funds. And, I can, as an executive director, as you know, commit funds for services that we don't have authority for. So we're faced with shutting down an investigation, shutting down a prosecution of a case, which becomes very problematic because of statute of limitations concerns and other issues. And having that additional attorney to assist and work on matters would lessen the chances of the commission having to stop work waiting for additional IFC funds. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. I mean, I was going to ask if you were able to quantify any reductions in those outside contracts, but I mean, based upon your answer about the reductions in their services, it doesn't sound as if you could, but I have to ask anyway.
Thank you. Paul Dyler for the record. Yes, I unfortunately, I can't. And any forecasts would blow up anyway if, one or two cases, we're dealing with one or two, 3 or 4 cases as opposed to one. As I said earlier, one case has exhausted 80% of our budget, operating budget. And that's very concerning. I also wanted to reiterate, and I believe that all of the committee members have received a copy of the commission's justification memo dated August 17th, 2020, where I go into quite a bit of detail of our needs for an attorney. So I just wanted to make sure that was part of the record.
We have. Thank you, sir. I have another question, and it's really about the new position as well, but the building. So if this position is approved, what's your plan about moving to a new location, which you're stating you need more room for to support this position? If you're in, because it seems like you're in a current lease agreement through August 31st of 2025. What's the plan to get out of that lease, I guess?
Thank you, Paul Dyler, for the record. Certainly, if we are approved with a new attorney, we would have to find a space. You're correct in that we are in the lease for a couple more years. And, we would look into having additional space in office space in the building that we're currently reside in. We reside in a building with the Governor's Office of Economic Development, GOED. And there's also additional buildings nearby that we may be able to rent an office space in the meantime, or just bring in another desk into our office here, which wouldn't be our first choice. But if we had to, we would certainly do that in the meantime.
Well, thank you, Director Dyla. I appreciate it. I don't see any other questions from any other committee members regarding this office, and I appreciate your presentation today, and appreciate what you do for the state. And I think with that, we can move on to the next agenda item. So thank you, Director. Appreciate it. Have a good day.
Thank you.
Our next agenda item would be public comment. And I ask that the broadcast services please open the public comment line, and let's leave it open for a little bit and see if we have any public who want to comment today on this hearing.
Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working, and there are no callers at this time. Would you like to take a 2-minute break to allow people watching time to call in? Chair Brooks, the public line is open and working, and there are no callers at this time.
Broadcast services, do we have any callers on the public comment line?
Thank you, Chair. The public line is open and working. There are
Chair,
no
at this
callers
time, it appears that there are no public callers. However, the line is open and working.
Well, with no public callers and a few minutes for them to jump on, it appears as if we are at the end of our business for this committee meeting today. So I'd like to thank all the members of the Joint Committee. And with that, we will adjourn.